This is a reading of Robin Page's Death at Whitechapel, the 6th chapter in the Victorian Mysteries series, and halfway through the entire series of 12. There will be English language in this that I, as a non-native English speaker, might pronounce wrong. There might also be instances of accents used. I will try my very best to pronounce these words and accents dialogues as I think they are pronounced, but I make no guarantee that they are absolutely correct. Chapter 1. Dearest, this is the only subject on which we ever fall out. If you only realized how little I have and how impossible it is for me to get any more, I have raised all I can, and I assure you, unless something extraordinary turns up, I see ruin staring me in the face. Lady Randolph Churchill to Winston Spencer Churchill, 5th of March, 1897. 35A, Great Cumberland Place, London, 3rd October, 1898. Jenny Churchill opened the drawer of her writing desk and took out an envelope. Her mouth taut, dark brows pulled together. She counted the notes, feeling an enormous resentment, then sealed the envelope and addressed it fiercely to A. Bird. She was done with it until next time. The small black pug at her feet roused and looked up at her with an anxious expression, as if to ask what the matter was. The next time, Jenny picked up the little dog and held it close, rocking back and forth. "How much longer can this terrible thing go on, Caro?" she whispered. "And what in heaven's name shall I do if he asks for even more? How can I—" There was a rap at the door, and it opened. A slender young man wearing the dress uniform of the 21st Lancers stood in the doorway, stick in one hand, helmet under his arm. "Hello, Mama," he said. "Darling boy," Jenny cried. She put the pug down and leaped to her feet, holding out her arms. "What a relief!" "Dearest Mama," Winston threw aside his helmet and stick, strode across the carpet. "How wonderful to see your face at last." The two could scarcely have looked at each other, however, so close was their embrace. Eventually this emotional greeting gave way to holding each other at arm's length, each exclaiming how marvelous the other looked, then returning to the embrace again, and to more exclamations and more tears. After a time, a very long time, they seated themselves on the sofa, still quite close together. They made a striking pair, the son not yet 24 years of age, pale with thin reddish-brown hair, and his father's protuberant eyes, the dark, elegant mother astoundingly youthful at 44 and renowned as one of the greatest beauties of England. "I cannot tell you, my dear Winston," Jenny said gravely, "how frightened I have been for you." She pushed her heavy dark hair away from her face with a shudder. "Omdurman, even the name conjures up fears. The news of the attack was in the Times on that Friday. I waited all through the day and the next for your telegram, which didn't arrive until after luncheon on Sunday. Lady Grenfell sent word that the offensive against the fort had been successful and that we had suffered no casualties, but you can imagine my state." She shook her head, making a wry face. "And to think how hard I worked to get around General Kitchener's and get you posted to Egypt, and then at the last you had to pay your own expenses. I know it was your heart's desire, but if anything had happened to you, I should have blamed myself." "To be sure, Mama," Winston smiled. "You left no wire unpulled and no cutlet uncooked to put me into the expeditionary force. I shall be eternally grateful to you for giving me my chance to join a significant action. But you know my luck in these things. At Omdurman I was under fire all day and survived without a scratch, not even a rip in my sleeve." "Thank God for that," Jenny said. Winston made a dramatic gesture. "I am sorry to say, however, that I shot 5 men, perhaps 7, though out of 10,000 dead dervishes I don't suppose my effort signifies. We only lost 5 officers and 65 men, but Colonel Rhodes was wounded and poor Hubert Howard was killed with a friendly shell. You cannot gild war, or the raw shows through." He smiled faintly. "But I intend to settle down to writing another history. The War for the Waterway, I am calling it. You can read all the glorious details there." I can wait, Jenny said. War is not my favorite subject, although, of course, dear boy, I am all for anything you write, as well you know. She patted his hand with a proud smile. Your dispatches for Borthwick in the Morning Post have caught everyone's eye, although I dare say General Kitchener is mightily miffed at your having written them. Your story of the Malakand Field Force sold 6,000 copies and is still strong, especially in India, where Lady Curzon says it's read by all the officers. Your agent, Mr. Watt, has sent you an accounting. It appears that you have already earned over £300 in royalties. £300? Winston's smile was rueful. That's more than I would receive in 4 years as a subaltern, and the writing was done in a few weeks. As for Kitchener, I don't care a fig for what he thinks of the post dispatches. The glorious victory at Omdurman was disgraced by the slaughter of the wounded, for which he alone must be held to account. He may be a general, but he was never a gentleman. The smile became a grumbling laugh. In that direction lies my future, Mamma, not in the sword, but in pen and in politics, speaking the truth as frankly and fully as possible. I don't know about the truth, Jenny said, but I have no doubt about your political future. You have heard me say many times how anxious I am to see you in the Commons, taking up where your father left off. She paused, thinking of Randolph and what had gone into the envelope, and how much it cost her to defend him. Not for his sake, certainly. She would not have lifted a finger to save her dead husband's reputation, but for Winston's. She would stop at nothing. Nothing. To enable Winston to fulfill the promise of leadership she knew he possessed. He knew this, but he also needed to know that she counted on him to help. I'm very glad to see you earning something by your writing, she said quietly. I don't suppose it's necessary to remind you that every shilling is wanted. I fear that we are in dire straits. There was a moment's silence. Winston bit his lip, while Jenny reflected on the grim truth of her words. Randolph had died nearly 3 years before, leaving an estate of some £75,000. After his debts were paid, the remainder was put in trust for the boys Winston and Jack. Although Jenny had been Randolph's wife for 20 years, she had received precious little. Only the horses, the household goods, and a meagre £500 a year. It was all she would ever get of the Marlborough millions, for the old Duchess would leave no more a token to Jenny, whose American forthrightness she had never appreciated, but Jenny's boys, of whom she was none too fond. Randolph's slim legacy, added to the annual $10,000 Jenny received from the rental of her father's Manhattan mansion, was her entire income. For a woman in upper-class British societies with 2 sons to support, it was not nearly enough to keep up appearances, much less to do the other things that Jenny wanted to do. But Jenny was determined that no one, except her solicitor Lumley and Winston, of course, should know the extent of her financial woes. She had taken a house in Great Cumberland Place, only a few blocks from Hyde Park, a fine 7-story house of Georgian design, albeit on the wrong side of Oxford Street, which somewhat reduced the cost. She had planned to economize on the furnishings and refurbishments, but the whole thing had needed painting, and hot water and electric light, the cost of which was appalling. Equally appalling was the cost of the multitude of servants required to staff the place and manage the dinner parties for which she had always been famous. And then there had been that deplorable business with Cruikshank, the fraud who had swindled her and her sisters out of more than £4,000. The miserable wretch had been sent off to jail, 8 years at hard labour, but not before he had spent all the money on fine living, making recovery impossible. Jenny's financial situation was so precarious that she had not even been able to pay Winston's allowance into the bank, and several of his checks had been dishonoured. But of course, he was as careless of his finances as she was of hers. In India, he had lived far beyond the £500 he got from her, and the 14 shillings a day the army paid him, and visited native moneylenders on a quite regular basis. Winston pushed his lips in and out. I did hope, he said after a long silence, that the loan Lumley arranged should have made things more comfortable for you. He spoke carefully, not quite looking at her. Jenny felt herself tense. At the beginning of the year, she had been forced to take out a loan for £17,000. 17,000! The size of the debt and the impossibility of repaying even a small portion of it still filled her with enormous anxiety. But equally hard was the rift the thing had caused between her and Winston. She had told him she needed the money to repay her many smaller notes and to settle some urgent dressmakers' and jewelers' bills. Almost the whole truth, but not quite. He had taken the matter quite hard, for Lumley had unfortunately arranged their business so that Winston was required to guarantee $700 a year. The unfavorable contract wasn't Lumley's fault, of course. Her credit with the banks was so very bad, and she had already borrowed what she could from her friends. Now Winston turned his head to look directly at her, and she saw that his pale eyes were hard as marbles. They reminded her unhappily of his father's eyes. "I hoped," he repeated, "that the loan should have made you more comfortable, Mamma." Jenny's hands fluttered and she clasped them in her lap. "Oh, it has," she said quickly. Now was the time to tell him about the photograph and those miserable letters before he distracted himself with the many projects he had arranged to undertake on his return. "But I'm afraid that something has arisen that I could not have anticipated when I—" "You speaking of Maggie?" Winston asked in a cautionary tone. "You should not consider the magazine your financial obligation, you know. You are to be the editor, not an investor. Not a penny of your money should go into it." Maggie was the sobriquet that one of Jenny's friends had given to her latest undertaking, a quarterly literary journal. "No, not of Maggie," Jenny said. "I have hired a managing editor who is raising the necessary funds. No, there is something else." She cleared her throat nervously. "I'm afraid I must tell you that." "Listen to me, Mamma," Winston spoke in a firm, measured tone. "You and I are both spendthrift and extravagant, and neither of us pays the proper sort of attention to money. But, and I say this in all sympathy, my darling, and not in all in anger, in comparison to your follies, my own are quite trifling. I may squander a few hundred on a pony or rare books, or a dozen of bottles of fine Scotch, but you are utterly suicidal in your expenditures. You must have lost £1,000 or more at the races at Goodwood." Jenny frowned. She loved her son dearly, but when he climbed onto his high horse and began to lecture her, he really was quite insufferable. "This is not the time for you to preach to me on extravagance, Winston," she replied sharply. "The current difficulties is not of my making and has enormous consequences for you." Winston did not appear to have heard her. "I'm sorry to be so blunt, Mamma, but someone must say it. You have brought us to the brink. If this constant financial drain continues, we will surely be ruined, and our peace and contentment will be ended forever." Then, his mouth relaxing, smiling the shy, boyish smile that always charmed Jenny, he added, "But the soldiers are home from the wars, dearest, and this should be a day of celebration. We shall put this wretched business aside and amuse ourselves. Is Jack in town? Is there a small dinner party somewhere tonight where I might pick up a few shreds of political gossip? I'm speaking again at Bradford in a few days, and I should very much like to appear in the know." His smile became wistful. Oh, how I wish, Mamma, that Papa could have heard me speak there in July. I was listened to with the greatest of attention for over an hour, and there was really a very great deal of enthusiasm, people mounting their chairs and applauding me. It was enormously gratifying." Jenny sat back thinking. Perhaps this was not the time to tell him about the banknotes in the envelope, or where they were going, or why. Perhaps it was not fair to seek her son's help in resolving this ugly business. He was so full of political ambitions and his plans for another book so aglow with the promise of his future. No, he was not the treason to help her think how to put a stop to this dreadful affair. But then who? Certainly not dear Jack. He was too young and just beginning to find his feet. But the burden was so great that she could not bear it alone much longer. Perhaps, shameful as the matter was, she should share it with the prince. The connection between Randolph and His Royal Highness had been strong in the end. Indeed, Bertie supported Winston's ambitions and had promised to help him in every way possible. The thought of it gave her a new hope. Yes, she would talk with the prince, and save Winston the trauma of knowing her secret, at least for now. She smiled tightly. "Your brother has gone off with Ernest Castle on some sort of business, but the Sheridans are in town, and have invited a very small group to Sipley House for dinner. Lord Charles will be glad to hear your reports. He asked me about you just the other day." "Sheridan! Ah, that great anomaly, a liberal lord." Winston smiled a worldly smile, and put his hands on his hip, his elbow jutting out in the style he had copied from his father. I heard that he was in the Sudan in the 80s, and quite a time there, in fact, so we can exchange reminiscences. Did you know that his wife is the pen behind those pseudonymous Bardwell stories, you fancy? A female Conan Doyle, or so she is being called. It is a well-deserved compliment, Jenny said. Lady Charles and I are discussing the possibility of her writing something for Maggie's first issue. A story from her is sure to attract readers. Well then, Winston stood, I'll just go and see if Walden has finished unpacking my gear. I have one or two little presents for you. And I shall send Lady Charles a note and let her know that you will be coming, Jenny said, making up her mind. She won't object. She is delightfully informal. She glanced at Winston out of the corner of her eye. George Cornwallis West is escorting me, since, of course, I had no idea when you would manage to get home. Winston paused on his way to the door. George, eh? Jenny could tell that he was making an effort, albeit not a very successful one, to screen the disapproval from his voice. Since you hadn't mentioned him recently in your letters, I thought perhaps the two of you were no longer... His lips tightened. Jenny, who did not intend to let her son tell her who she might take as a lover, let the silence only lengthen. Winston, my dear, she said at last, you can't possibly suppose that I tell you everything that's happening in my life.